United States has moved to tighten its grip on Iran's maritime lifelines, launching what President Donald Trump describes as a naval blockade targeting ships entering or leaving Iranian ports. The operation, announced to have taken effect at 10 a.m. Eastern on Monday, April 13th, is aimed at pressuring Tehran after ceasefire talks in Islamabad ended without a breakthrough. And as the wider confrontation around the Strait of Hormuz continues to rattle global markets, but within hours of the blockade taking effect, ship tracking data began to tell a more complicated story. Sanctioned vessels were still moving through the region, and at least one blacklisted tanker appeared to pass through the Strait of Hormuz without being stopped, raising immediate questions about how airtight any maritime cordon can really be in one of the world's most strategically congested waterways. At the center of the early test was a U.S.-sanctioned, Chinese-linked tanker named Starry. Tracking and anal WIDEX services, including LSEG data, marine traffic, and Kepler, indicated the vessel transited the Strait of Hormuz on Tuesday, April 14th, marking what appeared to be the first ship to leave the Gulf after the blockade began. The movement drew outsized attention because the ship is tied to an owner sanctioned by Washington over alleged Iran-related dealings, and because it highlighted the gap between a political declaration of maximum pressure and the operational realities of enforcing it at sea. According to the shipping analytics, Starry was carrying a methanol cargo estimated at roughly 250,000 barrels, loaded at an Emirati port, and it proceeded outward through Hormuz even as U.S. forces began implementing the new restrictions. The vessel's passage, widely tracked in real time by industry observers, underscored a critical detail about the U.S. posture. The blockade is framed as focused on traffic to and from Iranian ports rather than a blanket closure of the Strait of Hormuz itself. In other words, transiting the strait is not automatically prohibited if a ship is headed to or from non-Iranian destinations, even as the overall military presence rises and the risk environment intensifies. Still, the Starry transit landed like a political provocation because it looked, at least to outside observers, like a sanctioned tanker had just tested the new enforcement regime and made it through. That test may not be the last. Another tanker under U.S. sanctions, Kishan, was observed moving in the region and was reported to be heading toward Iraq with an anticipated plan to load fuel oil around April 16th, according to Kepler data cited in reporting based on Reuters' shipping data review. The appearance of multiple sanctioned or Iran-linked vessels moving despite a newly announced crackdown is precisely the scenario that blockade advocates say they want to prevent, and precisely the scenario critics say will be difficult to stop completely without rapid interceptions, SS, easers, and sustained deterrence. The White House message, however, has been sweeping. Speaking as the blockade began, Trump portrayed it as an immediate economic chokehold, insisting Iran's commercial activity had been stopped cold. He said, right now we have a blockade. They're doing no business. Trump went even further, framing the operation as both a punishment and a gatekeeper mechanism, arguing that ships should not be exiting if they were doing business connected to Iran. He said, I didn't like seeing boats come out if they were doing business with Iran, but if they weren't, no boats came out. And he concluded with a blunt, absolute claim about the effect of the operation. He said, so now Iran is doing absolutely no business. Yet the shipping data picture developing over the first full day of enforcement suggested the real-world impact could be more uneven, especially in the early phase when ship owners, insurers, and governments are still interpreting what the new rules mean, how aggressively they will be applied, and what consequences might follow if a vessel is challenged. Industry analysts and maritime security watchers have long warned that enforcing a blockade in and around Hormuz is not simply a matter of having warships on patrol. It requires identification, monitoring, clear rules of engagement, and most of all, credible, repeatable enforcement actions that convince commercial operators that the risk of being stopped is real. One expert summarized the logic succinctly: the early days matter most. If vessels can slip through at the beginning, the deterrent effect weakens. If vessels are intercepted quickly, the opposite can happen. The same analysts cautioned that even with strong U.S. naval capacity, a fully sealed blockade is unlikely in practice in such a dense and politically fraught maritime corridor. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping lane. It is a narrow maritime choke point connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, an artery for global energy exports, chemicals, and refined products. Any disruption, even partial, can ripple into prices and supply chains. And any military escalation raises the stakes for commercial navigation, particularly for companies whose ships might be flagged in one country, owned in another, chartered by a third, and carrying cargo for a fourth. That complexity is now colliding with geopolitics at full force. For the United States, the blockade is presented as leverage to force Iran back to a deal, especially on the nuclear issue, while also addressing broader regional security concerns tied to threats against shipping. For Iran, the blockade is framed as an illegal act of pressure that risks igniting a wider regional confrontation. And for countries like China, whose vessels and commercial interests are deeply embedded in Gulf trade, the situation creates a direct friction point with Washington's enforcement ambitions. Trump, in public remarks, suggested the blockade's goals could be expansive, not limited to a single negotiating demand. Asked about the end game, he made clear the operation was meant to apply pressure across multiple fronts. He said maybe everything did. He then linked the blockade to both diplomacy and economics, asterisk. He said, both of those things certainly and more, asterisk, and he framed the dispute as a fight over coercion and leverage in global trade routes. He said, we can't let a country blackmail or extort the world because that's what they're doing. We're not going to let that happen. At Aztecs, at the same time, he argued the United States could endure the shock better than other nations because of its domestic energy production, while noting that global markets would still feel the strain. He said, we don't need this trade. We have our own oil, gas, much more than we need. Trump also meant that oil shipments were shifting toward the United States, describing vessels heading in to load American supplies. He said there are many boats coming to our country, and he signaled that a negotiated off-ramp might still be possible, saying contact had been made and that Iran wanted a deal. Asterisk, he said, we've been called this morning by the right people, the appropriate people, and they want to work a deal. Asterisk, he said they would like to work a deal, but the nuclear red line remained the fixed point in his account of what derailed the Islamabad track. He said it was over nuclear. Then, in language meant to leave no ambiguity, Trump repeated the core demand. He said Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. He framed it not as a negotiable item, but as a non-starter, warning there would be no deal without that commitment. He said there'll never be a deal. And he ended with a threat, too. Hat blended diplomacy and force, suggesting the United States would get what it wanted through agreement or through compulsion. He said either we'll get it back from them or we'll take it. Against that backdrop, the early ship movements through Hormuz were more than a maritime footnote. They were a real-time referendum on whether Washington's pressure campaign can be translated into operational control without igniting a larger conflict. Meanwhile, Moscow is moving to signal political backing for Tehran and to criticize U.S. and Israeli military actions. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has held a phone conversation with Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in recent days, with both sides emphasizing diplomatic coordination at a moment when the ceasefire framework appears fragile and the maritime confrontation is sharpening. Iranian state-linked media reported that Araghchi warned about the consequences of what he described as provocative U.S. actions in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, arguing that such moves could endanger not only regional stability, but wider international security. The readouts also indicated that Lavrov condemned U.S. and Israeli strikes while urging Washington to demonstrate seriousness in returning to diplomacy. The message from both capitals was that they intend to keep bilateral and multilateral consultations active and to use diplomatic channels to try to stabilize a situation that is rapidly turning into a stress test for the global economy. That diplomacy, however, is unfolding alongside military posturing, contested narratives, and ships moving in ways that can be interpreted by different actors as either lawful transit, deliberate defiance, or escalation by stealth. The key point is that the Strait of Hormuz remains for now open to commercial movement, yet increasingly militarized and politically charged. The United States is trying to squeeze Iran by targeting Iranian port traffic. Iran is warning the Regio, and that pressure on its ports could broaden the conflict. China's commercial footprint is deeply exposed, and Russia is aligning rhetorically with Tehran as the diplomatic process frays. What happens next may come down to a narrow window, the first days of enforcement. If U.S. forces move to intercept or seize ships linked to Iranian ports, the deterrent effect could strengthen, but so could the risk of confrontation. If sanctioned or Iran-linked vessels continue to move without challenge, the political claim of a chokehold will be harder to sustain, and the perception may spread that the blockade is porous. For markets, even uncertainty can be enough. Insurers raise premiums, shippers reroute. Charter rates surge, cargoes delay, and prices respond not only to actual disruption, but to the fear of what a single miscalculation could trigger in one of the world's most volatile corridors. In the immediate term, the rich Starry transit has already become a symbol used by critics to argue the blockade is leaking and used by hawks to argue enforcement must tighten fast. The next ship and the next decision by commanders on the water could determine whether this becomes a sustained pressure tool or the opening chapter of a wider maritime showdown.